study. In the name of the Father, and we gather here this evening under your care and your protection. We thank you for your unconditional love, your unending mercy and kindness that never fails us. Open our hearts and our minds to learn more about your church tonight, that you would guide our thoughts and our actions always to do your will and for your glory. Strengthen us, fill us with your peace, so that we may love and serve each other as your Son has shown us. We ask this through your Son, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever.
Amen.
So last week, just to kind of, as a 2-minute review, last week I initially talked a little bit about some church history to give us a background for the creed. If you remember, it originated from the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. Bishop Barron covered 2 words of the creed. So we talked about God and how we come to believe in God, how we come to believe what the church teaches. He mentioned John Henry Newman, who was a prominent theologian who tackled issues of faith and reason, and how we assent to our religious beliefs in the same way we assent to scientific beliefs and claims, through a combination of intuition, personal experience, and a series of arguments or debates that we sometimes will do with ourselves and with other people, and then the evidence that we see. So we reach conclusions and we assent to other claims in the same way we do to religious claims. But we rarely accept anything just based on one single argument or one single fact. But knowing God is a little different than knowing other things, because things are created and depend on some sort of outside cause for their existence. God cannot be understood in the same way some things are. I like what St. Augustine said, and he mentions it in the guide, that if you think you understand God, it's not God. I remember a story about Fulton Sheen, Bishop Sheen. He was teaching a catechumen, and the lesson that night was on the Trinity. And he talked for 45 minutes about the Trinity. And after he finished talking, he said, "Do you have any comments?" And the catechumen he was teaching said, "Oh, now I fully understand the Trinity." And Bishop Sheen said, "Darn it, I got to start all over." So we don't understand God. We don't understand the Trinity in the same way we understand other facts. So he talked about some of the paths briefly, how we understand the existence of God through our intelligence, through contingency. We talked about that briefly, and by moral arguments. So that's kind of what he covered in the first session. Tonight's session is on the next clause, phrase of the creed, which is, "I believe." And now we're going to go into one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. So tonight he's going to spend 45 minutes on about 13 words. So, but it's a great talk. And then afterwards we'll go over our questions. Just going to briefly read the questions because I think it helps. And I'm going to paraphrase them. So first question is, what does saying "I believe in one God"? Second question is, what kind of attributes are supportive of the statement "one God" in the creed? How would you explain this? And he talks about this. Third question is, why does God create? And he'll talk about this at length. Fourth question is, what did St. Augustine mean when he said, That God is higher than anything we can imagine, yet closer to us than we are to ourselves. And the fifth question talks about non-coercive providence and our freedom, our free will. So what is God's non-coercive providence? Freedom. And then the sixth question, which is a very age-old question, is why does evil exist in a universe that is infinitely good and that a loving God has created? Why would evil exist? And then the last question is, what is meant by the statement, God created heaven and earth, all things visible and invisible? So those are the questions, those are the things he's going to bring up in the next 45 minutes or so. All right?
At 5 years old, Thomas Aquinas is said to have posed to his catechism teacher the question of all questions. But Master, what is God? The Creed gives us a succinct but inexhaustible answer. The one God, unlike any other. Furthermore, God is Father. He generates, cherishes, and directs all things. And God is Creator. The non-contingent source of all contingent reality. So we've looked at three words: I, believe, and God. But we've overlooked now a very important fourth word. So think, credo in unum Deum. I believe in one God. And I want to focus now on that word one. The unity of God, as you know, is basic to biblical belief. Think of the great Shema prayer in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone. The unity of God, Shema, and about the credo in unum Deum, in one God. He said it's a subversive claim. How come? Because it's disallowing any other claimant to ultimacy in our lives. If I say I believe in one God, I'm implying, well, the state is not God, the president's not God, the culture's not God. Nothing else is of ultimate importance to me. God alone. Credo in unum Deum, the unity of God. Now, the unity of God can also be shown in a more philosophical way. So keep in mind that argument from contingency that I developed. The conclusion of which is some reality which exists through the very power of his own nature. The one who does not derive his being from something else, from some extrinsic cause, but exists through the power of his own nature. This must mean that this reality has no potentiality, is not dependent upon anything outside of itself, but rather exists in the state of what Thomas Aquinas called actus purus, pure act. I've always loved that description of God. Actus in Latin really translates energeia from the Greek, energy. God, energy, pure actuality. God exists in the fullest possible sense of that term. That's what actus purus means. Well, you see how that's related now to the unity of God. There can't be two of these things running around. There can't be two actus purus. You see why? The minute I say 1, 2, this is not bad, I'm implying each is potential vis-a-vis the other. A is not B. B is not A. Whenever you have differentiation, you've got potentiality. But God is actus purus, pure act. There's no potentiality in him. Hence there can't be multiple gods. Credo in unum Deum. I believe in one God. That's a biblical truth, and it's philosophically coherent truth. And from the unity of God there follows the attribute that I think is maybe most characteristic of God. What Thomas Aquinas calls the simplicity of God. God is the simplest reality of all. Now, mind you, that does not mean that God is primitive as opposed to complex beings. Really, just the opposite. It doesn't mean God's at some lower level of development. Simplicity here means something very distinctive. Namely, that God is. He's not in a particular way, not according to a particular form, not received according to a particular essential principle. God is. Now, I'll make it a little more concrete. So here I am before you. I exist. But I'm not the sheer act of existence. I'm a human being, right? I'm a being, yes indeed, but I exist in a very definitive, definite, restricted way. I'm here and now in this bodily form. I'm this rather than that. I'm not any other kind of being. My being is extremely restricted. The camera into which I'm speaking right now is a being, indeed, that it exists, but it's not the sheer act of existence. It's a being of a very definite technological type. The church I'm in right now exists, it's a being, but not the sheer act of being itself. It's a church. It's a being according to a particular type. God. It's a bad question. It's a wrong question. David Burrell, the theologian from the University of Notre Dame, famously said, to be God is to be a being of a technological type. To be God is to be. Here's the way Thomas Aquinas puts it in his technical language. In God, essence and existence coincide. Now I know that sounds very abstract, but it's really what I've been talking about. So in me, there's a real distinction between existence, that I am, and essence, what I am. Think of my act of existing as poured into the receptacle of what I am. I'm a human being. In me, essence and existence in fact, are different in any creature. Whether it's the planet Jupiter, an archangel, this camera, or me, we are beings of a particular type. But to be God is to be. In him, essence and existence coincide. Now, by the way, I wonder if this has come into your mind. In the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus, when Moses asked God his name, what shall I tell the people when I ask the name of this God who's speaking to me? What technical philosophical language? In me, essence and existence coincide. Put it in spiritual language, stop asking me such stupid questions. See what I'm saying? Moses is asking, well, what kind of being are you? Which of the gods are you? I am who I am. That's the voice of God in his ontological simplicity. To be God is to be. Now notice something, everybody. I know this can seem all very achingly abstract. The one who is, answer, everywhere. Why? Because the sheer act of being itself is what stands behind the being of everything in the world. God is in all things, Aquinas says, by essence, presence, and power. Is being itself in this room? No, not at all. Because this room is just filled with beings. God, as I said, is not one of the beings in this room. The one who is simultaneously aliter, right? lovely Latin phrase for totally other. And as close to me as I am to myself. Does that make sense? To get that, and of course, get it, I have to put in quotes, to gesture in that direction is to understand something of the simplicity of God. Totaliter aliter. Closer to me than I am to myself. That's why St. Augustine said it so beautifully. God is superior sumo meo et intimior intimo meo. That means higher than anything I can imagine and closer than the most intimate part of me at the same time. That's what it means to speak of God's simplicity.
Bishop, you say God is not a creature, but it seems he acts like a creature in the Bible. How do we understand this discrepancy?
Well, of course, the Bible uses different types of language. Sometimes it uses very high abstract language. Think of things in the second part of the prophet Isaiah. Other times it uses much more imagistic and poetic language. Think too of this. St. Irenaeus saw this a long time ago. That just as we, educate a young kid by using certain types of language when he's very young, and then we make it a bit more sophisticated as he gets older, and then as he gets to be an adult, we'll use, entirely appropriate language, appropriate to the object of our discussion. Well, in a similar way, think of the Bible as God's steady education of the people Israel. Would he use sometimes more childlike language, pictorial language, where God is put in very anthropomorphic terms? Yeah, sure. Does that mean that that's appropriate now to a more adult level of question? Well, no. And you see a kind of evolution within the Bible itself from a more pictorial to a more sophisticated type of language. So I'll just be careful about the kind of language, the kind of genre the Bible is employing. So I've gone now from God's unity to God's simplicity. And now from God's simplicity, I want to derive a number of attributes of God. We speak in the great tradition of the via positiva and the via negativa, right? The positive way and the negative way. By the positive way, I mean this. Because of who God is, I can take anything that's beautiful, good, true, and positive in the world and say that must also be true of God. The via negativa, I must take anything that's imperfect in the world, everything marked by potentiality or limitation or imperfection, and say that doesn't belong to God. The via positiva, the via negativa. So, look at the via positiva first. I can say, for example, that God is good. So I look at all the things around me and I see them as good. Good, Thomas Aquinas argues, means desirable. What's desirable? Well, the perfect, right? Whatever I'm desiring, whatever is good, is something perfect. God, who's fully actual, actus purus, therefore must be absolutely perfect and therefore absolutely desirable. God is supremely good. What else can we say under the via positiva? Well, if God is actus purus, God has all possible perfections, then God must be personal. Right? And having mind, will, freedom, intention, all that's part of our perfection as persons. Therefore, in a supereminent way, it must be true of God. God has mind, will, intention, freedom, creativity. Of course he does. Any philosophy that says God is just some abstract principle or is just a force or something. No. The whole Star Wars thing, that God is like the force that runs through all things. Oh, hum. I mean, let's say there is such a thing. Who knows? Who knows? Let's say there is. It's not God. That's some created energy. No, God is a person because God must have every creaturely perfection. What else can we say under this rubric? We must say that God is loving. Now, it's a very interesting argument Thomas Aquinas makes. What's to love? To love is to will the good of the other, right? Now, that can mean I will the absent good that I seek. So I love something, I'm seeking a good I don't have. Or it can mean that I rest in, I savor the good that I possess. Think of, from being in the presence of someone you love to watching a baseball game. Those are both forms of savoring a good that I possess. God has mind and will. God is supremely good, and so of course God savors the good that he is. God loves himself. And by extension, God loves whatever participates in his being. That means the whole world. So God is intelligent. God has will. God has purpose. God has freedom. God has goodness. God is loving. All of that I derive from the simplicity of God, which I derive from the unity of God. Okay? That's the via positiva, and there's much more we could say. This actually was in the psalm that I prayed this morning as part of my morning prayer. That lovely psalm that says, could the one who formed the eye himself not see? Could the one who formed the ear himself not hear? You see, the argument he's making is, look, is seeing a good thing? Obviously. Could the one who formed the eye to see himself not see? Now, it doesn't mean God sees with a animal eye, like the way I have, which is a very limited way of seeing, right? I can just see what's right in front of me, and I can see according to a very limited spectrum of light and color. What I mean is if God can make the eye, well, then he sees in this supereminent way. That's all the via positiva. Okay, how about the via negativa? Think here of a sculptor. Think of Michelangelo, who famously said, I'm just trying to take away everything that surrounds David. So he's looking at this great marble block, and he said, David's in there. I just got to take away everything in that block that's not David. Right? Now that's the way a genius thinks about it. Now here's a first example. We speak of God as infinite. I know that can sound like a positive term, but it really isn't. Infinite means without finis, or without border or limit. To see a border would make something potential, not actus purus. So God doesn't have any kind of limitation to his being. Now, what's that like? Well, I challenge you to get your mind around that idea. See, you can't, because the mind always wants to categorize and put in boxes and understand and so on. Well, you can't do that with the infinite God, the one without borders. We speak in a similar way of God as being immaterial, don't we? Is that a positive statement? Not really. What we're saying is he's not material. Now why? Because see, matter by its very nature is potential. Matter can become something else. It can change forms. I could burn this podium to ash. This building I could knock down and turn into something else. Matter is by its very nature potential. Therefore, God can't be characterized by matter. He's not material. Now, what's that like? I'll challenge you to come up with a really clear idea of it. Not easy. In a similar way, we speak of God as being immutable, unchanging. Well, you see why. Things that change are potential. They're in one state and they become something else. They move from potency to act, as Aquinas says. Well, God doesn't have any potency, therefore God doesn't change. Now, mind you, don't take this to mean that God is cold and uncaring. That's ridiculous. It just means that God doesn't change or get better in a creaturely way. In fact, God's immutability is the ground for our confidence in God, isn't it? That we can rely upon God. He doesn't change. But what does that mean in itself positively? Very hard to get our mind around, because everything in our experience is mutable. Here's the last one. We speak of God as being eternal. And you say, well, that sounds like a positive idea, that God, goes on and on. Well, it doesn't mean that God goes on and on. That would be something existing endlessly in time. Think of like a vampire, never dies, lives on and on. No, when I speak of God's eternity, I mean he's not temporal. I mean he's outside of time, because time always involves change. There's no change in God. Time involves potentiality. If I'm in this moment of time and later in that moment of time, But God doesn't exist that way. Therefore, he's outside of time. What's that like? Give me a really positive notion of eternity. I don't know. I can't really imagine that. What I'm doing with all these terms, immaterial, immutable, infinite, eternal, is I'm carving away from the idea of God anything that smacks of creaturely imperfection.
Given all this science?
No. And one of the problems I really have is we always set the thing up that way, or in the popular imagination it's seen as some kind of war between science and religion. What I was talking about in describing God as creator of all things, that's a qualitatively different type of question than the questions raised by the sciences. The scientists examine the world empirically, they experiment upon it, they make hypotheses, they draw conclusions, etc. But it's about the things, objects, and events within the empirically measurable universe. The question I'm asking is a more fundamental one. Namely, why is there something rather than nothing? Why would the world that science examines exist at all? Well, see, that's not a more fundamental question. In some ways, I would say this, that in between religion and science, I might put philosophy. There's a rational path, but I think we've tended to forget about that in our enthusiasm for science, 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 as though science answers everything. Science answers some things, some questions very well. Others it can't even address. One of them is, why is there something rather than nothing? That's a philosophical, and then I would say ultimately religious question. So it's like apples and oranges. People always want it to be a war between two types of apples. Take a little while. So I believe in one God. And what I've done is I've derived from the argument for God and from the unity of God these various names. And there's much more we could say about it. But I want to move now to the next phrase in the creed. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. Now, there's a kind of an eloquent ambiguity here, because the creed will talk about the Father as the first person of the Trinity, and we'll get there. But I think here, when it talks about God as Father, it's talking not so much about the first person of the Trinity as about God as the creator of all things. See, because a father is someone who gives rise to another, right? The Father generates something outside of himself, finite reality. God, the Creator. First question to ask, and it's a puzzling question. Why does God create? God is God, right? Actus purus, pure act, utterly perfect, simple. The sheer act of existing. Any and all ontological perfection belongs to him. Therefore, creation can add nothing to his being. There's no advantage to God in creating. So how come he creates? I mean, anything I do, there's always some kind of self-interest involved. God must create, since obviously he has, right? That's one thing we can say for sure. We can see it. God creates not out of need, but therefore out of sheerest love. To love is to will the good of the other, as I said. You see how that's all God can do vis-a-vis the world that he makes, because he doesn't benefit from it. He doesn't need it. He can't derive any further perfection from it. Therefore, he does so out of the sheerest love. Self-gift. Don't sentimentalize the term. I know we can get kind of drippy and sentimental with the word love, as though it's a passing feeling. No, it's an act of the will. The very existence of the world from moment to moment witnesses, and this is what the mystics have intuited. The very existence of the world from moment to moment witnesses to the fact that it's being loved into existence. Beautiful, I think, beautiful. What can we say now further about creation, about God's fathering forth of the world? First of all, don't think of it in terms of something that happened in time. as though time is marching along, and then at a certain point, God creates. God is eternal. He's outside of time. Time comes to be with the coming to be of the world. Time itself is something that God makes. And this implies something of great importance. Creation didn't just happen way back when and then is over. Rather, creation is an ongoing event. Aquinas talks about creatio continua, continual creation. Herbert McCabe, the contemporary Dominican theologian, says that God sustains the universe the way a singer sustains a song. Isn't that lovely? Think of an opera singer singing. The song depends from moment to moment on the opera singer's self-gift. And so Actus Purus, the simple God, continually sings the finite universe into being. That's what creation means. A further implication of the doctrine of creation is that all things are connected to one another. Now, I know it's easy to, as we look at the world at sort of a superficial level, to see us as separate individuals. All the people and animals and things and so on, separate individuals. But think of this. Every moment, every one of us is coming forth from the same creative source. So when I find my deepest center, as Thomas Merton said, that place in me where I am here and now being created by God. That's Merton, but it's entirely Thomas Aquinas too. When I find that place in me where I am being created by God, I found the same place in you. And the same place in everybody else. In fact, the same place in, as St. Francis put it, brother, sun, and sister moon. That's not just high poetry, that's accurate metaphysics. The sun and moon and planets and stars are indeed brothers and sisters to us. All of creation linked together through God the Creator. What else can we say in light of this doctrine of creation? Well, we must speak of God's providence. You know, again, we're tempted sometimes by a sort of deism that says God is a distant cause way back when, or maybe by a sort of Star Wars mysticism by which God is just a vague impersonal force. No. God, in all things by essence, presence, and power, yes. God present to all things every minute, yes. Where's God? Everywhere. But listen, God, who is mind and will and freedom and creativity and purpose, can never be dumbly present to things. God is always present with mind and will and purpose and freedom and creativity. In other words, he's providential over all of creation. That's the point. That lovely quote from the Book of Wisdom, Aquinas loved to cite it. I love to cite it too. Listen, the wisdom of God stretches from end to end of the universe mightily and orders all things sweetly. Terrific. Let me say it again. The wisdom of God stretches from end to end of the universe mightily and orders all things sweetly. Some things, just the high things? No. All things. Thomas Aquinas says that God's providence extends to particulars. Lovely. In other words, he's not just providential over the high, important realities, but rather his providence extends to all reality. From the archangels to insects crawling on the ground. Is God present providentially right now as I speak these words? Yes. His providence extends to particulars. Can I suggest to everybody, that's at the heart of the spiritual life, is to come to recognize that place where you are not right now being directed by a providential God. Now, in light of this, a question naturally arises. Well, how about my freedom? If God is providential over all things, including everything I do, how do I have any real freedom? Well, we have to understand what freedom means. There's a more modern understanding of freedom that construes liberty as self-determination, right? I decide what to do. I decide who I will be. I got option A, B, C, and without any sort of constraint, I say I'm going to go with option A, and that's freedom. Well, if that's what freedom is, then God's providence is a kind of threat to my freedom. In fact, if I start thinking about freedom along those lines, I'm going to end up becoming. But I would suggest to you, there's a more classical, more biblical understanding of freedom that sees it not so much as self-determination, but rather as the disciplining of desire, so as the achievement of the good. You'll know what I mean now when I give you some examples. So I'm before you right now as a pretty free speaker of English. I mean, I can say pretty much whatever I want in English. And as someone who studied other languages, I know what it feels like to be unfree. You're trying to say what you want. I remember being in a seminar class in Paris years ago, and I knew what I wanted to say, but my French was so bad that I couldn't say it right. Or now when I'm studying Spanish and I'm preaching and I know what I want to say, but I can't quite come out with it. Okay, that's a form of unfreedom. Well, I'm a free speaker of English. Why? Well, because I decided when I was a kid to speak any way I wanted. Come on. You know, when I was a kid, I took in syntax and grammar and vocabulary and the example of so many other speakers of English around me. I incorporated the good of English so it became eventually part of me. It became second nature to me. Anyone that's learned to play a musical instrument knows what I'm talking about. Hey, just go there and play anywhere you want on the piano. Well, of course not. You took in lessons and you've exercised and you listened to other piano players and you listened to your teacher and you incorporated the moves of piano playing until it became second nature to you. Until you became free enough to play what you wanted. Well, see, in this second understanding of freedom, the good is not the enemy of freedom. It's the condition for the possibility of freedom. So God, the supreme good, God who providentially is present to all things, is he trying to suppress my freedom? No, God is awakening my freedom. I can think of my whole life as just a process of God luring and inviting me into a deeper and deeper freedom as I incorporate the good that he holds out to me. Now we're talking. The glory of God is a human being fully alive, as St. Irenaeus said. God glories in my freedom, which in fact is a gift of his providence, not opposed to his providence. And that leads me to maybe the problem of problems in all of theology. Some say that theology itself is an attempt to respond to this problem. If you've been listening so far and you say, okay, Bishop, I get it. God exists and Actus Purus and he's full of mind and will and love and he's providential over all things. He's not threatening my freedom. Okay, I'm with you. The problem of suffering. If God exists and he's good and he's providential, why in the world is there so much suffering and so much evil? Well, I'll say this. I've been a priest for 35 years. I've been a Christian all my life. A real problem? You bet. Do I feel it in my bones? Yeah, of course I do. Everyone who's the least bit reflective, who's had the least bit of experience, understands the reality of this problem. Now, there are some things we can say in response to this issue, this question. A first one, and it was a great discovery of the young St. Augustine, namely that evil is not a positive force. not something that stands as a rival to the good. Don't think about dark side and light side of the force. I'm going after Star Wars again. But evil is not a positive force. Rather, it's what Augustine saw, a privatio boni in his Latin, a privation of the good. It's a lack of a good that ought to be there. Think of a cavity in a tooth. Think of the compromising of an organ caused by disease. Evil is not a rival to the good, but it's parasitic upon the good. In other words, the first move is not to give too much ontological weight to evil, to see God as fighting against some sort of co-equal rival. So we speak not of God creating the good, of the evil, but of God permitting evil. And you say, well, okay, I get that, but it still begs the question, doesn't it? Why would God permit evil, indeed on such a massive scale, as we look at the tremendous suffering in individual lives and then in a more global sense? Why would God permit such evil? Well, second great insight, also one of Augustine's intuitions, that God permits evil so as to bring out of it a greater good. Now, again, I think the job that I wanted and I didn't get it, and I was so angry and so frustrated, but that led me to another job which actually proved to be so much better for me. There's that school, I wanted to get into that university and I didn't get in. It would seem like nothing but evil, but it sent me to another university where I met my spouse. I mean, I lost this friendship, but the loss of it actually led to a deepening of my faith in God. I mean, we can see examples galore of this in our own lives. However, we can't always see it, can we? There are some evils, both again on the personal and the global level, that seem very hard to justify by this principle. But again, keep this in mind. And Thomas Aquinas was so strong on this. Our vision of things is so limited. The little bit of space and time that we can take in, where God is working with all of space and all of time. Is there a morally justifiable reason for permitting a given evil? Well, sometimes I can see it, yeah. Most times I can't. But my lack of vision, my lack of understanding should not determine the question. Does God have a morally justifiable reason for permitting certain evils? I think we have to say yes, which is the whole point of the book of Job, isn't it? As Job complains at God's injustice, God complains at the great evil he was enduring. And God's answer, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? In other words, Job, what do you know about my providential guidance of the entire universe? What do you know about why I permit certain evils? These principles don't answer the problem. Framework for approaching the question.
In terms of the problem of evil, I get the argument, but I still struggle, particularly when evil manifests itself as pain and cruelty.
Everybody does, you know, and I totally get that you can lay out the great principles as I did, but still, at a visceral level, we feel the press and the difficulty of this. I mean, I completely understand it. I might just share a couple of, look, I don't get this. Aren't you supporting me here? Aren't you on my side? How many ones? I couldn't even begin to explain it to him. He was old enough to feel the pain and to feel the confusion of it, but not old enough to understand something as complex as, well, you know, surgery, which takes something out of you, but in the long run you'll be better. And so the father wanted to explain why the son was going through this pain. He couldn't do it. And it struck me as a really interesting analogy to us vis-a-vis God. Might we be going through suffering that does have a great moral and salvific purpose, but we can't see it, and even if God wanted to explain it to us, he couldn't, because of the radical difference between his mental capacity, which covers all of space and time, and mine, ours, that covers such a little swath of space and time. Here's the second story. It's somewhat related. But I was helping out at a parish many years ago. And every Sunday, to this parish would come this, again, younger family. Mom and dad with about 5 kids. And one of the kids, a young girl, was very handicapped, both physically and mentally. And she was sort of strapped into her chair, you know, and they would sit in the front section right there at Mass. And the little girl during Mass often became agitated or, you know, kind of fussy. And as I'd see her, I'd think, just think of the suffering she's gone through. Think of the suffering this family's gone through. But you know what always caught my eye? One of her brothers, who was, I'd say maybe around her age, maybe a little younger, no more than 9 or 10. This little guy, week after week, without drawing any attention to himself, very calmly would attend to his sister when she got agitated. He would take care of her, you know, physically, and he would kind of calm her down. Very, you know, kindly, unobtrusively. Well, I remember reflecting, you know, why is this family going through this suffering? I don't know. I don't have the breadth of vision to see why. But it occurred to me, is that brother growing as a person of extraordinary compassion? Is his sister's suffering making him someone with a very compassionate heart? And then I sort of allow my mind to drift, go forward 20, 30 years. Might that young man have a son to whom he passes on that same compassionate heart, who then one day in the even more distant future has a daughter to whom he passes on that same compassionate heart, and that daughter becomes a saint precisely at the time when the church most needs exactly that saint. Now, you see what I'm doing? I'm not trying to, you know, explain it and, oh, that solves the problem. But I'm trying to gesture toward a way of thinking about it. God looks not just at the here and now, as we tend to do naturally, you know, we're caught up in some terrible suffering. God has command of all of space and all of time. Why answer is in God's time, in God's space, with God's purpose in mind, which we can't see clearly. You know, neither one of those solves the problem. Of course it doesn't. But they shed certain light, it seems to me, on the dynamics of this question. The last topic now I'll use in this talk, I'll address in this talk. We speak of God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. Now, in one sense, heaven and earth is just an ancient way of saying everything, right? What's up, what's down, everything in between, heaven and earth. But I like the addition of the inner phrase, all things visible and invisible. The visible word. I mean, yes, how splendid it is. Look up into the starry sky at night, walk on the beach and look at the splendor of that display. Look into the heart of a human being. I mean, the visible universe is stunning in its beauty and complexity. But is there a dimension of the world that's not visible to our eyes, that's even more spectacular and stunning, that God has also created? Well, I'll give you one hint. We deal with the invisible actually all the time. Anytime we deal with numbers or with mathematical or geometrical objects. You know, I learned that when I was a high school student. When you draw a line, well, that line that you can see that you drew with your pencil, that's just a symbol. That's not the line. It's the visible symbol of an invisible reality. Right? I sketch a triangle, or I turn into a pyramid. Well, that sketch is just a symbol, isn't it, of the pure triangle that my mind entertains, the pure cylinder that my mind holds. And mind you, engineers use these invisible realities to build very visible things. These aren't wild fantasies. These are realities, invisible to be sure, but real, that we come in contact with all the time. Think of the number 7. I could write it as a symbol. That's all that is. It's a symbol of a pure abstraction, the number 7. You know who saw this centuries ago was Plato. When we escape from the cave of just our ordinary, sensible impressions of the world, we come first, he thinks, to the level of mathematics. Real? Invisible? You bet. And God is the creator of that realm as well. Now go higher. The Bible witnesses to the presence within God's creation of angels, of pure spirits, spiritual like God, but not infinite like God. Creatures like us, but spiritual like God. The angels. Of course, that lovely word, angel, from the Greek angelos, just means messenger. Think of them as mediators between this world of visible reality and the realm of God. Angeloi, angels, mediate between them. I think of this in the Bible. Think of an adult who can condescend, as it were, to enter into the experience and mind of a little child. An adult could, crouch down and use very simple language and move into the thought world and experience world of a little child. But the child could never, in principle, rise up and have an adult conversation. Well, think of these angels, these pure spirits, part of God's invisible creation. Can they, as it were, condescend to us, enter into our very limited experience, even though we cannot on our own rise up to their level of complexity? That's, I think, how the angeloi, the messengers, communicate with us. Well, if there are angels, immaterial spirits, is it that hard to imagine that some of them would have fallen? So we're embodied spirits. There are a handful of saints, most of us are sinners, who have to some degree fallen away from God. Is it that hard to imagine that some of these spirits would have fallen into rebellion against God? We call these fallen angels the devils. Rivals to God? Hardly, come on. There's no rival to God. Evil's always a privation of the good, isn't it? The devil's mind, will, power, freedom, all that is good. All that's from God. What's twisted and perverse, the devil's rebellion, that's parasitical upon the good. God permits them, yes indeed. How come? I don't know. Maybe someday we'll know. Devils are real, but they're not rivals to God. They're creatures. Under God's providence, under God's authority. God makes all things visible and invisible. And let me close with this. Think of God, actus purus, being itself, the simple God, as like pure white light. The color white contains all colors. But the white light passes through a prism and then it breaks into a variety of colors. Think of creation now as the infinitely intense white light of God's perfection, breaking through a kind of prism and manifesting itself as this wild diversity of color, complexity, variety. In the visible order, yes, and in the invisible order as well. All of it functioning as a kind of icon of the invisible God. All of it functioning as a manifestation in the creaturely order of God's perfection.
Some people would ask whether these beliefs about God are just bound by the culture, rather than being one objective truth pointing to something real. Why is the Christian God true and not the gods of the pagan world or other religions?
Well, the first observation I make is this, that it's not right to say, we're right, they're all wrong. It's not as black and white as that. There are rays of light. There are indications of truth in all the great religions and religious philosophies of the world. So it's not a strict either or. For example, in the pagan mythology, the gods in the ocean is personified, the way the sky is personified, the way the earth is personified. And those stories tell us great truths about the natural necessities. I could say something similar about other great religions. They speak some truth. But to your first part of the question, let's say you're struggling with this. You want to know, is this Christian revelation, true? Well, you could use some of the philosophical arguments I was using to say, well, yeah, using my reason, I can determine that God exists, that God is infinite, that God is personal, that God is the creator, that God is provident. Well, all of that's contained in the Bible. And so that image of God in the Bible is coherent with what my reason comes to know. So I think you can use reason to verify, if you want, what's been given in the Bible.